In the shadowed halls of Shadowvale Penitentiary, behind walls that have crushed the spirits of thousands, walks a man who shouldn't be there. Zephyr Koralis, once Nova Haven's most brilliant architectural engineer, now prisoner 247891, serving life without parole for a murder he didn't commit. But what the steel bars and concrete walls couldn't contain was a force more powerful than any earthly justice system. This is the extraordinary story of how an innocent man's darkest moment became the catalyst for a miracle that would shake the foundations of everything he believed. What happened within those prison walls defies explanation, and by the end of this video, it will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the power of divine intervention. Before we dive into this incredible journey, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking moments ahead as this story unfolds. Trust me, what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about miracles in the modern world. The glass and steel towers of Nova Haven's business district reflected the golden sunset like burning mirrors, as Zephyr Koralis stood atop his latest architectural triumph, the Obsidian Tower. At 42, he had everything society claimed marked success: multiple awards for innovative design, a corner office with a view that made lesser men envious, and a reputation for turning impossible projects into reality. But what set him apart wasn't just his brilliant mind for engineering. It was his absolute devotion to precision and proof. "If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist," Zephyr would tell his team, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of experience. "Feelings don't hold up buildings. Numbers do." This wasn't just his professional motto, it was his life's philosophy. Every decision, every relationship, every moment was calculated, measured, and validated through the lens of pure logic. The irony wasn't lost on him that his obsession with measurable truth would be what the prosecution used to destroy him. That fateful evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Zephyr was reviewing the final stability calculations for the Obsidian Tower's innovative support system. The building was his masterpiece, a 128-story marvel that seemed to defy gravity itself. But unlike his competitors who occasionally cut corners, Zephyr's designs were meticulous. Every variable accounted for, every safety margin tripled. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, 17 floors below, his business partner Theron Aldrich lay dead in their shared project room, and the security cameras that would have proved Zephyr's innocence had been mysteriously disabled. The next 48 hours moved with the surreal quality of a nightmare. The evidence mounted with suspicious precision: his access card used at the time of murder, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, a ceremonial letter opener he'd received as an award, and most damningly, financial records showing apparent embezzlement that provided motive. The prosecution, led by the ambitious Meridian Blackthorne, painted a picture of a calculating killer who had used his brilliant mind to plan the perfect murder. "Your Honor," Blackthorne had said during the trial, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom of Stormhaven Courthouse, "Mr. Koralis's own words condemn him. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist." Well, we have measured everything: the time of death, the angle of the fatal wound, the financial transactions. The evidence is irrefutable. His defense attorney, Leander Cross, fought valiantly, but the jury saw what they were meant to see: a brilliant man whose precision and logic made him capable of executing a flawless crime. The fact that Zephyr maintained his innocence with calm, rational arguments only reinforced their perception of his calculating nature. The verdict came on a gray Tuesday morning: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: life without possibility of parole. As the guards led him from the courtroom, Zephyr caught a glimpse of his daughter Vesper's face in the gallery. At 16, she had her mother's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him with love before cancer took her 5 years earlier. Now those eyes held something else: a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and worst of all, doubt. "I'll find a way to prove it," he called out to her, his voice steady despite the chains. "The truth can be measured, Vesper. The truth will show." but she turned away, and that was the last time he would see her face for years to come. The massive gates of Shadowvale Penitentiary closed behind him with a sound that seemed to echo through his bones. Built into the side of a cliff on Widow's Peak, the prison was a monument to containment, a place where society stored its darkest elements. The irony of its architectural brilliance wasn't lost on Zephyr. In another life, he might have admired its design. "Welcome to Shadowvale, Mr. Koralis," the intake officer said, his voice devoid of emotion. "God have mercy on your soul." Zephyr's response was automatic. God is just another unmeasurable variable. Little did he know those words would come back to haunt him, because in the darkness of Shadowvale, where logic and reason held no power, something unmeasurable was waiting, something that would shatter every equation he'd ever believed in. And in Cell Block D, Cass Thalamir, a man who would become instrumental in Zephyr's transformation, heard the new arrival announcement and smiled. He'd been waiting for this one. Sometimes faith had its own calculations. The first 3 months in Shadowvale taught Zephyr Koralis that time wasn't the steady, measurable constant he'd built his career on. In prison, minutes stretched into eternities, while days collapsed into mere moments. His cell, a 8 by 10 foot concrete box, became both sanctuary and torture chamber, a place where his brilliant mind had nothing to do but replay the events that led him here, searching endlessly for the variable he'd missed. But it wasn't the loss of freedom that haunted his sleepless nights. It wasn't even the betrayal that had landed him here. No, what clawed at his soul was a deeper wound, one that had begun forming long before Shadowvale's gates ever closed behind him. 23 years earlier, on a bright summer morning, 9-year-old Zephyr had stood in his father's workshop, watching the older man meticulously measure boards for a cabinet. Magnus Koralis was a master craftsman who believed in the perfection of numbers, a trait he passed down to his son, like a sacred inheritance. "Remember, Zephyr," Magnus would say, his calloused fingers tracing the measuring tape. "Wood can lie, eyes can deceive, but numbers never fail. Trust only what you can measure." That same afternoon, Magnus Koralis collapsed at his workbench. The doctors called it an aneurysm, swift, unpredictable, unmeasurable until it was too late. Young Zephyr, who had stepped out to fetch more nails, returned to find his father sprawled across the workshop floor, surrounded by perfectly measured wooden pieces that would never become a cabinet. The memory surfaced now as Zephyr lay on his prison cot, staring at the ceiling. "You were wrong, Dad," he whispered into the darkness. "Some things can't be measured, like how much it hurts to lose you." Then came Sarah, his wife, the one person who had challenged his rigid worldview with her artist's heart and unwavering faith. She painted emotions instead of calculating them, saw beauty in imperfection, and believed in things that couldn't be quantified. For 15 years, she had been the color in his world of black and white precision. "Not everything that matters can be measured, my love," she would say, painting yet another sunset that never quite matched reality but somehow captured its essence perfectly. "Some things you have to feel to understand." But Zephyr couldn't feel his way through the cancer that took her. He approached it like an engineering problem, researching treatments, calculating survival rates, measuring every variable he could find. In the end, none of it mattered. Sarah slipped away on a Tuesday morning, leaving him with a 10-year-old daughter and a heart he refused to acknowledge was broken. Dr. Helios Voss, Shadowvale's prison psychiatrist, noted in his initial evaluation that inmate Koralis exhibited classic signs of unresolved trauma masked by extreme rationalization. But Zephyr had dismissed the diagnosis with the same logical precision he applied to everything else. "Trauma is just an unmeasurable excuse for emotional weakness," he told Dr. Voss during their second session, his voice carrying the same conviction that had once commanded boardrooms. "I've simply learned that emotional attachment leads to mathematical uncertainty." Yet here in Shadowvale, surrounded by men broken by life's unmeasurable cruelties, Zephyr's carefully constructed walls began to show their first cracks. It started with the letters, or rather, the absence of them. Every week he wrote to Vesper, sending her detailed explanations of his innocence, pages filled with logical arguments and precise timelines. Every week, the letters returned unopened. The pain of her silence defied measurement. His cellmate, a young man serving 5 years for fraud, watched Zephyr's ritual with the returned letters. "Maybe she needs her father," the man suggested one day. "Not another mathematical proof." Zephyr had no equation to calculate the weight of those words. In the prison yard, under the watchful eyes of guard Cyrus Ambrose, Zephyr maintained his isolation, spending exercise hours walking the perimeter, 13 steps along the short end, 27 along the long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Numbers were still his comfort, his shield against the chaos of prison life. But at night, when the lights went out and the calculations couldn't drown out his thoughts, other numbers haunted him. 5. The age Vesper was when she first asked about God after Sarah started taking her to church. 15. The number of paintings Sarah left behind, each one a testament to the beauty of unmeasurable things. 23. The minutes it took for the jury to destroy his life with a verdict he couldn't appeal. It was during one of these nights, as the mountain winds howled around Shadowvale's ancient walls, that Cassius Thalamir first appeared at Zephyr's cell. The older inmate's presence commanded respect, even from the guards, though he'd been imprisoned longer than most of them had been alive. "Your numbers won't save you here, Architect," Cassius said, his voice carrying the weight of decades behind bars. "I've watched men like you come and go. The ones who survive aren't the ones who count their steps or measure their days. They're the ones who learn to measure what can't be measured." Zephyr wanted to dismiss the words as prison philosophy, the kind of mystical nonsense he'd built his life rejecting. But something in Cassius's eyes, a peace that seemed impossible in this place of violence and despair, caught his attention. "And what exactly can't be measured?" Zephyr asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Cassius smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Faith, hope, redemption. The very things you'll need to survive what's coming." "What's coming?" "Your moment of truth, Architect. And when it arrives, all your calculations won't mean a thing." As Cassius walked away, his footsteps echoing in the darkness, Zephyr felt something he couldn't quantify, a tremor in his carefully constructed world of certainty. For the first time since entering Shadowvale, he began to wonder if some variables in life's equation couldn't be measured after all. 6 months into his life sentence, on a stormy evening that made Shadowvale's iron bones creak, the catalyst that would shatter Zephyr's rational world arrived in the form of a riot. It began in the cafeteria during dinner, when the lights flickered from a lightning strike and plunged the prison into momentary darkness. By the time emergency power kicked in, chaos had already taken hold. Zephyr had been eating alone, as usual, precisely measuring the distance between each item on his tray, a habit that helped him maintain some sense of control. When the darkness hit, he remained seated, calculating the statistical probability of violence based on previous prison riot data he'd memorized from the library. But some variables couldn't be calculated. Through the growing chaos, he spotted young Marcus Chen, a 19-year-old first-time offender, who reminded him too much of what Vesper's age would be now. 3 members of the Iron Creed gang had cornered Marcus against the serving line, their intentions clear in the glint of makeshift weapons. "Stay logical," Zephyr told himself, even as something deeper than reason stirred within him. "The guards will handle it. Calculate the odds. Measure the risks." But in that moment, as Marcus's terrified eyes met his across the cafeteria, Zephyr realized some decisions transcended mathematics. Before his logical mind could protest, he was moving, crossing the space between them with measured steps that quickly became a sprint. "Leave him alone." The words tore from his throat, surprising him with their intensity. The gang members turned, momentarily startled by this unexpected intervention from the normally isolated professor, as they mockingly called him. What happened next defied every calculation. As the first attacker lunged, Zephyr's body moved with a precision born not of planning, but of pure instinct. He deflected the crude blade, using the momentum to push Marcus toward safety. But in doing so, he left himself exposed. The pain was immediate, a sharp burst of fire in his side as another weapon found its mark. As he stumbled backward, blood seeping through his prison uniform, time seemed to slow. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the chaos, and in their glare, Zephyr saw something that his rational mind struggled to process. Cassius Thalamir stood in the doorway of the cafeteria, completely still amidst the chaos, his eyes locked on Zephyr. The older inmate's lips moved, forming words that seemed to echo despite the riot's din. Sometimes salvation comes through sacrifice. Guards flooded the cafeteria, but Zephyr was already fading, his blood forming a perfect circular pattern on the floor. One last measurable thing as consciousness slipped away. His last thought was of Sarah's voice. Some things you have to feel to understand. He awoke in the prison infirmary 3 days later, his side throbbing but his mind strangely clear. Dr. Helios Voss stood over him, consulting a chart with a puzzled expression. "By all medical calculations, Mr. Koralis, you should be dead," the doctor said, his accent thickening with emotion. "The weapon nicked your liver and you lost a dangerous amount of blood. Yet here you are, defying medical science." Zephyr tried to focus on the numbers, blood pressure readings, survival statistics, recovery metrics. But something else kept intruding on his thoughts. The face of young Marcus visiting him in dreams during his unconscious state, transforming into Vesper's face, then Sarah's, then his father's. "Your daughter called," Nurse Bennett said softly, changing his bandages. "First time since you've been here. She heard about what you did for that boy." The pain medication couldn't account for the warmth that flooded his chest at those words. It was an unmeasurable sensation, like the grief he'd never properly felt for Sarah, like the love he'd tried to quantify for Vesper. Reverend Aristides Devereaux, the prison chaplain who had been a distant figure until now, appeared in the infirmary doorway. The tall, austere man carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in Shadowvale. "Mr. Koralis," the chaplain said, pulling up a chair, "I'd like to talk about what happened in the cafeteria, about why you did what you did." Simple risk assessment, Zephyr attempted, falling back on familiar territory. The boy's age, the statistical probability of severe injury. "No," Reverend Devereaux interrupted gently. "I want to talk about the real reason, the one that can't be measured." Something in the chaplain's tone breached Zephyr's defenses. Maybe it was the pain, or the medication, or the lingering effects of his brush with death, but he found himself speaking words he'd never allowed himself to consider. "I saw my daughter in him," he whispered. "I saw every calculation I'd ever made that failed to keep my family safe. And for once, I didn't want to measure the consequences. I just wanted to help." The chaplain nodded, as if Zephyr had finally solved a complex equation. "That, Mr. Koralis, is the first step toward understanding what truly matters in this world. And it's why you're still alive." "Medical science," Zephyr began, but the words felt hollow. "Tell me," Reverend Devereaux said, leaning forward, "how do you measure a soul? How do you calculate the weight of redemption? What's the mathematical formula for grace?" Before Zephyr could respond, Cassius appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding even the chaplain's attention. "The numbers don't add up anymore, do they, Architect?" he asked, his voice carrying that same mysterious certainty. "Good. That means you're finally ready to begin." "Begin what?" "Your real sentence," Cassius said cryptically. "The one that will set you free." Recovery in Shadowvale's infirmary brought changes that defied Zephyr's mathematical mind. The first was the steady stream of visitors, inmates he'd helped over the months in small, uncalculated ways he hadn't even registered. Each carried a story of how his precise mind had solved a problem, offered advice, or simply provided a moment of clarity in their chaotic lives. But it was the dreams that truly began to unravel his rational world. They started subtly at first, fragments of memories that didn't quite match reality. He would see Sarah in her studio, painting one of her sunsets, but the colors would swirl off the canvas and form patterns that spelled out messages he couldn't quite read. His father's workshop would appear, the carefully measured boards arranging themselves into impossible structures that somehow held profound truths just beyond his comprehension. The medication, he told Dr. Voss during a checkup, trying to find a measurable explanation. It must be affecting my REM sleep patterns. The doctor adjusted his glasses, studying Zephyr with unusual intensity. Interesting theory, but tell me, how do you explain what happened this morning? Zephyr shifted uncomfortably on the infirmary bed. He'd been trying not to think about it. During his morning vital check, every medical device that touched him had mysteriously malfunctioned. Blood pressure readings sprouting impossible numbers, digital thermometers displaying strange symbols instead of temperatures, heart monitors picking up rhythms that seemed to sync with the distant church bells from Trinity Sanctuary. Equipment malfunction, Zephyr said firmly. Probably electrical interference from the storm system moving through. The storm that only you've seen? Dr. Voss asked quietly. Zephyr stared at him. He'd been watching dark clouds gather over Shadowvale for days, but every time he mentioned them, others looked at him strangely. The weather had been clear for weeks. Guard Cyrus Ambrose, making his rounds, paused at Zephyr's bed. Still seeing those clouds, Mr. Koralis? There was no mockery in his voice, only a strange mix of concern and something that might have been awe. They're right there, Zephyr insisted, pointing out the window. But even as he spoke, he realized the sky was a perfect, empty blue. The incidents multiplied as his recovery progressed. His perfectly ordered world began to slip sideways in ways that no equation could explain. The numbers in his engineering books, which he'd requested to maintain his sanity, began rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Equations he'd known his entire career suddenly revealed new solutions. Solutions that shouldn't have been possible, but somehow felt more true than the originals. One night, unable to sleep, he began calculating the structural stress points of Shadowvale's architecture, a habit that usually calmed his mind. But as he sketched on the medical chart Dr. Voss had left behind, he noticed something impossible. The prison's foundations, when mapped according to his calculations, formed a perfect geometric pattern he'd seen in one of Sarah's last paintings, a pattern she'd claimed came to her in a dream about divine architecture. Coincidence, he muttered. Statistical anomaly. Is it? Cassius's voice came from the darkness. The older inmate had an unsettling habit of appearing when Zephyr's certainty wavered. Or is it something your numbers can't explain? There's always an explanation, Zephyr insisted, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Like the explanation for this? Cassius pulled out a newspaper article that made Zephyr's blood run cold. The headline read, "Key witness in Koralis murder case vanishes after claiming divine intervention." Lysander Thaddeus, whose testimony had been crucial in Zephyr's conviction, had apparently walked into Stormhaven police station the previous day, demanding to speak to Detective Callista Ravencroft. He claimed he'd been visited by an angel who showed him the truth about the murder. Before he could make an official statement, he disappeared from a locked interview room. The security cameras showed only a bright light and then nothing. Psychological break, Zephyr said automatically. Guilt-induced hallucination. Like your storms? Cassius asked. Like the numbers that change when you're not looking? Like the fact that every time the church bells ring, your heart beats in perfect synchronization? Zephyr's hands trembled as he set down the article. He'd spent his entire life believing in the measurable, the provable, the concrete. But now... The world is larger than your measurements, architect, Cassius said softly. The question is, are you brave enough to accept that? Before Zephyr could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridor. Marcus Chen, the young inmate he'd saved, burst into the infirmary, his face pale with excitement. Mr. Koralis, they found something in Mr. Aldrich's office. A hidden camera. It was running the whole time. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A hidden camera, evidence, proof. His logical mind grasped at this tangible hope, even as another part of him wondered at the timing. Sometimes, Reverend Devereaux's voice came from the doorway. Divine justice works through human channels, but make no mistake about whose hand is truly at work. The Reverend stepped into the room, and for a moment, just a moment, Zephyr could have sworn he saw wings of light shadowing the chaplain's form. He blinked and they were gone, but the impossible sight lodged in his mind like a splinter in his carefully constructed worldview. "The camera footage," he began, trying to focus on the concrete. "Will show exactly what it needs to show," Cassius interrupted. "But that's not the real miracle happening here, is it, Architect?" Thunder rolled overhead, thunder that only Zephyr could hear, and in its rumble he finally recognized the sound of his certainties beginning to crumble. The day everything changed began like any other in Shadowvale, except for one detail. The temperature in the prison had dropped inexplicably by 20 degrees, despite the heating system running at full capacity. Zephyr, now recovered enough to return to his cell, found himself drawing complex mathematical models of heat distribution, trying to explain the impossible cold that seemed to concentrate around certain areas of the prison. "Your calculations won't help you today," Cassius said, appearing at his cell door. "It's time." "Time for what?" "Your first real prayer," Zephyr scoffed, but the sound died in his throat as he noticed something strange. His breath was visible in the air, but Cassius's wasn't. Before he could comment on this impossibility, an announcement crackled over the prison's intercom system. All inmates were to report to Trinity Sanctuary for a mandatory memorial service. A guard had died overnight, heart attack during his shift. "Officer Reynolds," Zephyr whispered, recognizing the name. The guard had shown him kindness once, sharing family photos and stories during a long night in solitary, a punishment for protecting another inmate from harassment. As the prisoners filed into Trinity Sanctuary, Zephyr's engineering mind couldn't help but analyze the chapel's architecture. The ceiling rose in elegant arches that seemed to defy structural physics, and the stained glass windows captured light in ways his calculations insisted were impossible. But today, something else caught his attention. The temperature dropped even further as he crossed the threshold. Reverend Devereaux stood at the pulpit, his usual austere presence somehow amplified. "Today, we remember a man who served with honor," he began, but Zephyr barely heard the words. His attention was fixed on a figure standing in the shadow of the altar, Officer Reynolds himself, translucent but undeniably present. Zephyr's logical mind began spinning explanations. Stress-induced hallucination, light refraction through the stained glass, the psychological impact of grief. But each theory crumbled as Reynolds' apparition turned and looked directly at him. "You see him, don't you?" Cassius whispered. "Because you're ready to see." The ghost of Officer Reynolds smiled sadly and pointed toward the chapel's back corner. There, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood another figure, Theron Aldrich, the partner Zephyr had allegedly murdered. But unlike Reynolds' peaceful presence, Aldrich's spirit seemed tortured, bound by chains of darkness that writhed like living things. "This isn't possible," Zephyr muttered, his voice shaking. "Ghosts don't exist. They can't be measured, quantified." "Some things aren't meant to be measured," Reverend Devereaux's voice cut through his panic. The service had ended. The other inmates were filing out, but Zephyr remained frozen in place. The chaplain approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty chapel. "They're meant to be witnessed." The temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the pews, creating intricate patterns that matched the equations Zephyr had been drawing obsessively in his cell. Officer Reynolds' spirit moved closer, and with him came a wave of memories. Not Zephyr's own, but the guards. Images flashed through his mind. Reynolds watching security footage from the night of Aldrich's murder, seeing something that made him reach for his phone, then clutching his chest as an unnatural darkness filled the security room. "He was trying to help you," Cassius said softly. "He found evidence of your innocence, but someone stopped him." Aldrich's spirit thrashed against its dark bonds, trying to speak. Though no sound emerged, Zephyr could suddenly read the words forming on his former partner's lips. "Meridian Blackthorn, knew, arranged everything. The prosecutor's name hit Zephyr like a physical blow. As if triggered by his recognition, the chapel's stained glass windows began to vibrate. The light passing through them split into impossible spectrums, forming equations in the air, not the familiar mathematics of his engineering work, but something older, deeper, like the fundamental calculations of creation itself. "What's happening to me?" Zephyr gasped, his rational mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "Your eyes are opening," Reverend Devereaux said, placing a hand on Zephyr's shoulder. The chaplain's touch sent a shock through him, and suddenly he could see more, glimpses of a reality behind reality. The chapel's architecture wasn't just physical, it was built on lines of spiritual energy that pulsed and flowed like living mathematics. "There is a divine geometry to all things," the chaplain continued. "You've spent your life measuring the shadow of truth, but now you're beginning to see the truth itself." Officer Reynolds' spirit approached Zephyr, extending a hand. Without thinking, Zephyr reached out to take it. The moment their hands met, solid flesh against ethereal form, every light in the chapel exploded in a cascade of supernatural brilliance. The equations floating in the air burst into flames that burned with cold fire, and Zephyr felt something inside him break open. All his life, he had believed that truth could only be found in measurable facts, in provable theories, in concrete evidence. But in that moment of contact between the physical and spiritual worlds, he experienced something that transcended measurement. A reality so vast and complex that his mathematical mind could only process it as pure, overwhelming wonder. Through their connected hands, Reynolds shared one final memory: the truth about the night Aldrich died, captured on a security camera feed that had been deliberately erased. But more than the evidence of his innocence, Zephyr received something far more profound: the ability to see beyond the veil of physical reality. As the vision ended and Reynolds' spirit began to fade, Zephyr fell to his knees. The frozen equations hanging in the air melted like spring ice, their drops falling upward instead of down, defying the very laws of physics he had built his life upon. "The first break is always the hardest," Cassius said, helping him to his feet. "When everything you believed about reality shatters, and you realize that truth is bigger than your ability to measure it." "But why me?" Zephyr asked, his voice hoarse. "Why show me these things?" "Because, architect," Reverend Devereaux answered, his form seeming to shimmer with that same hint of wings Zephyr had glimpsed before. "Sometimes God needs someone who understands the mathematics of the physical world to help reveal the architecture of the spiritual one. Your imprisonment here was never about justice, it was about preparation." As if to confirm his words, the chapel's altar split with a sound like thunder, revealing beneath it a perfect geometric pattern that matched both Sarah's final painting and the structural diagram Zephyr had discovered in Shadowvale's foundations. But now he could see what his previous calculations had missed. It wasn't just architecture, it was a key. In the days following the incident at Trinity Sanctuary, Shadowvale transformed around Zephyr in ways that shattered every conception of reality he'd ever held. The prison's granite walls, once solid and measurable, now seemed to pulse with hidden energies. Mathematical formulas appeared spontaneously in impossible places, carved in his morning oatmeal, formed by the shadows of clouds across the exercise yard, traced by the flight patterns of birds outside his cell window. But it wasn't just the physical world that was changing. The inmates and guards moved through Shadowvale like actors in a divine play, each one trailing visible threads of light that connected them to each other and to something vast beyond the prison walls. Zephyr could see their pain, their hope, their faith manifested as tangible auras that shifted and changed with each decision they made. "You're seeing the true architecture of creation," Cassius explained during their exercise period. Today, the older inmate's usual calm demeanor seemed charged with anticipation. "Every soul is a living equation in God's mathematics." As if to demonstrate, Cassius touched the chain-link fence that surrounded the yard. The metal immediately crystallized into patterns of sacred geometry, each link transforming into a symbol that Zephyr somehow recognized from the deepest parts of his soul. The symbols matched the ones he'd seen beneath Trinity Sanctuary's altar, but now they moved and shifted, telling a story he was only beginning to understand. "Watch," Cassius commanded softly. A group of inmates passed by, and Zephyr gasped as he saw their life stories written in lines of light around them. Marcus Chen, the young man he'd saved, burned bright with potential futures branching out like golden fractals. Another inmate, a man serving 20 years for armed robbery, dragged shadows of guilt that formed precise angles of redemption waiting to be fulfilled. "How is this possible?" Zephyr whispered, his engineer's mind struggling to process the mathematical perfection of what he was witnessing. "You're asking the wrong question," Reverend Devereaux said, appearing beside them. Today, the chaplain's wings were clearly visible to Zephyr's transformed sight, vast arrays of light that folded through dimensions he'd never imagined existed. "The question isn't how, but why you're being shown these things." Before Zephyr could respond, a commotion erupted at the prison's main gate. Detective Callista Ravencroft had arrived, carrying a file folder that blazed with spiritual significance in Zephyr's new vision. But something was wrong. Dark shapes slithered around the detective, trying to prevent her from entering the prison. "Those are the same shadows that bound Aldrich's spirit," Zephyr realized aloud. "Now you're beginning to truly see." Cassius nodded. "Watch what happens next." Guard Cyrus Ambrose approached the gate to check the detective's credentials. As he did, Zephyr saw something remarkable. Ambrose's ordinary uniform transformed into armor of light, and a sword of pure truth materialized in his hands, visible only to Zephyr's awakened sight. The dark entities recoiled from the guard's unconscious authority. "Some warriors never know they're fighting a spiritual battle," Reverend Devereaux commented. "They simply do what's right and heaven works through them." The detective made it inside, but the shadows regrouped, taking new forms. Zephyr watched in horror as they coalesced into a sophisticated geometric pattern, a dark mirror of the divine mathematics he'd been witnessing. This corrupt equation spread through Shadowvale's infrastructure, attempting to rewrite the prison's spiritual architecture. "Meridian Blackthorn," Zephyr breathed, recognizing the signature of the prosecutor who had condemned him. "She's trying to stop the truth from coming out." As if triggered by his words, every electronic device in Shadowvale went haywire. Security cameras sparked and smoked. Computer screens displayed cascading patterns of ones and zeros that Zephyr now recognized as prayers in an ancient digital language. The prison's power grid fluctuated wildly, creating a light show that most inmates and guards attributed to electrical problems. But Zephyr saw the truth. This was warfare on a level he'd never imagined possible. A battle between light and darkness fought with weapons of pure mathematics. The very foundations of Shadowvale groaned as spiritual forces contested for control of the physical space. "The prison itself is awakening," Cassius said, his voice filled with awe. "It remembers its true purpose." Zephyr looked closer at Shadowvale's architecture, and suddenly he understood. The prison hadn't been built just to contain bodies. It had been designed as a spiritual fortress. Every angle, every measurement, every structural choice had been guided by something far more profound than mere engineering principles. The original architect knew, Reverend Devereaux confirmed, reading Zephyr's revelation. Like you, he was a man of science who learned to see the divine mathematics. Shadowvale was built to be a place where heaven could reach into earth, where justice could be tempered with mercy, where transformation was possible. As if in response to these words, the geometric pattern beneath Trinity Sanctuary's altar began to pulse, sending waves of energy through the prison's spiritual gridwork. The dark equations trying to corrupt the system started to falter and fade. "It's responding to you," Cassius said urgently. "The prison recognizes another architect who can see its true nature. Quick, what do you see in its design? What's the pattern trying to tell you?" Zephyr closed his eyes, letting his transformed consciousness merge with Shadowvale's architectural spirit. The numbers sang to him now, a symphony of divine intentions expressed in perfect mathematical harmony. In his mind's eye, he saw the prison's blueprint overlaid with patterns of celestial significance. Every cell, every corridor, Every security checkpoint had been placed according to sacred ratios that formed. "It's not just a key," he whispered, opening his eyes. "The entire prison is a lock. A lock designed to contain something far more dangerous than criminals." "Yes," Reverend Devereaux's voice carried the weight of centuries. "And now you understand why you were sent here. Why your false imprisonment was allowed." "Because I can read the mathematics," Zephyr said, watching as Detective Ravencroft approached, her file folder still glowing with promised revelation. "I can see how heaven's geometry intersects with Earth's engineering." "And?" Cassius pressed. "And because something is about to break free that was never supposed to escape." Zephyr turned to face Trinity Sanctuary, where dark clouds that everyone could now see were gathering. The question is, was it locked away, or was it waiting? The storm that gathered above Shadowvale defied every meteorological principle Zephyr had ever studied. The clouds formed perfect logarithmic spirals, their movements describing equations of cosmic significance. Lightning flickered in precise geometric patterns, illuminating layers of reality that seemed to fold in on themselves like infinite origami. Detective Ravencroft reached their group just as the first thunder broke. In Zephyr's transformed vision, her badge glowed with the same divine authority he'd seen in Guard Ambrose's spiritual armor. But the file she carried burned even brighter, truth made manifest in physical form. "Mr. Koralis," she began, her voice steady despite the supernatural display above them. "We found something in—" She never finished the sentence. A sound like shattering glass filled the air as reality itself seemed to crack. The dark equations that had been gathering strength burst through Shadowvale's spiritual defenses, taking physical form. Where moments before there had been empty air, now stood Meridian Blackthorn, but not as Zephyr remembered her. The prosecutor's form wavered between human and something else, her business suit appearing alternately as ancient judicial robes and writhing shadows. Around her neck hung a corrupt version of Lady Justice's scales, each bowl containing stolen moments of time, wrongful convictions, and perverted justice. "I thought I might find you here, Detective." Meridian's voice resonated on multiple frequencies, some too low for human ears. "Pursuing yet another futile appeal?" "This is no appeal," Ravencroft stood her ground, though Zephyr could see her aura recoiling from the darkness that emanated from Blackthorn. "This is exposure." The corrupt prosecutor laughed, and mathematical symbols of decay spread across the prison walls like toxic ivy. "Exposure? I've spent centuries ensuring that justice serves my purposes. Do you really think one little piece of evidence will undo that?" "Centuries?" Zephyr whispered to Cassius. "She's not just a corrupt prosecutor," the older inmate replied, his own form beginning to shimmer with previously hidden power. "She's something that's worn many faces throughout history, always twisting the law to serve darkness rather than light." Reverend Devereaux stepped forward, his wings now fully manifested. The chaplain's true nature blazed so bright that several inmates fell to their knees, overcome by the sight that only Zephyr could fully perceive. "Your time here is ending," Devereaux declared, his voice carrying the authority of divine law. "The architect has seen the truth of this place. The patterns are unraveling." "The architect?" Meridian's gaze fell on Zephyr, and for a moment, her human disguise fell away completely. What stood in her place was living mathematics gone wrong, sacred geometry twisted into impossible angles that hurt the mind to witness. "This is who heaven sends to oppose me? A man who couldn't even see beyond his own calculations?" "But I see now," Zephyr found himself saying, strength flowing into him from the very foundations of Shadowvale. "I see how you corrupted the measurements, how you took the divine mathematics of justice and twisted them into instruments of persecution." As he spoke, his consciousness expanded further. He could see Meridian's influence throughout history. Ancient courts where she'd whispered poisoned logic to judges. Modern courtrooms where her corrupt calculations had sent innocent men to death row. The pattern was always the same, taking the precise measurements of justice and distorting them just enough to serve darkness while maintaining the appearance of law. "You think seeing is enough?" Meridian waved a hand, and the dark equations around her intensified. The very air began to crystallize into geometric patterns of despair. I've spent millennia perfecting these calculations. Every wrongful conviction, every corrupted judge, every twisted testimony adds to my power. The mathematics of injustice are far stronger than your newfound faith. To demonstrate, she touched the ground. Instantly, a wave of corruption spread through Shadowvale's spiritual architecture. The sacred ratios that Zephyr had discovered began to warp and twist. Inmates throughout the prison cried out as their own spiritual chains, the invisible bonds of guilt and punishment, began to tighten. But then something unexpected happened. As Meridian's corrupt mathematics reached the foundations that had been laid with divine inspiration, they encountered equations that even she couldn't corrupt. The original architect's work was too perfect, too aligned with cosmic truth. "You never wondered," Cassius said, stepping to Zephyr's side, "why this prison was built in this exact spot, why every measurement was so precise." Understanding flooded Zephyr's awakened mind. Shadowvale wasn't just a prison, it was a trap, but not for the inmates. "The original architect," he breathed, watching as pure mathematical truth began to rise from the foundations. "He knew you would come here. This whole place was designed to contain your corruption until heaven sent another architect who could see the divine mathematics," Reverend Devereaux completed. "One whose false imprisonment would teach him to see beyond physical laws to the spiritual equations that govern all reality." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Meridian's inhuman features. The dark calculations swirling around her faltered as Shadowvale's true nature began to assert itself. Detective Ravencroft seized the moment, opening the file she carried. Light burst forth. Pure truth captured in photographs, documents, and testimonies. The evidence of Zephyr's innocence burned away the corrupt equations that had bound it in darkness. "No!" Meridian's form stretched and distorted as she tried to maintain control. "The calculations are perfect. The corruption is complete." "That's where you're wrong," Zephyr said, placing his hand on the prison wall. Through his touch, he could feel the divine mathematics singing in the stone. "True equations can't be corrupted. They can only be revealed." The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Meridian Blackthorn, her form wreathed in the mathematics of corruption, centuries of twisted justice amplifying her power. On the other stood Zephyr, supported by Cassius's ancient wisdom, Reverend Devereaux's divine authority, and Detective Ravencroft's burning truth. Around them, Shadowvale trembled as competing mathematics fought for control of reality itself. The question was, which equations would prove stronger? The natural laws that Zephyr had once worshipped, the corrupt calculations that Meridian had perfected, or the divine mathematics that he was only beginning to understand? Above them, the geometric storm intensified, and the answer began to take shape in patterns of light and darkness that would rewrite both his destiny and the very foundations of justice itself. As reality buckled under the weight of competing mathematical forces, Zephyr felt something inside him begin to fracture. His mind, that precise instrument that had designed skyscrapers and calculated load-bearing stresses to the millimeter, was being pulled apart by two opposing truths. On one side, every scientific principle he'd ever known screamed that what he was witnessing was impossible. The laws of physics, the constants of mathematics, the very foundations of material reality, all violated by the supernatural display before him. His logical mind produced explanation after explanation, mass hallucination, psychological break, complex atmospheric phenomena. But on the other side, a deeper part of him, the part that had been awakening since his first supernatural encounter, recognized a higher mathematics at work. The divine equations weren't breaking the laws of physics. They were revealing the deeper principles from which those laws emerged. Having trouble reconciling the angles? Meridian's mocking voice cut through his internal struggle. She raised her hands, and the corrupt mathematics around her intensified. "Let me help you see more clearly." Suddenly, Zephyr's vision shifted. He saw himself as he had been, the proud architect, the rational man, the being of pure logic. That version of himself stood in his old office, surrounded by the comfortable certainties of physical laws and provable theorems. Everything made sense there. Everything could be measured. That's who you really are, Meridian pressed. A man of science, of reason. These spiritual equations you think you see? They're just your mind trying to process trauma through the lens of mysticism. Deep down, you know none of this can be real. Her words found purchase in the part of him that still clung to his old understanding. The weight of years spent worshipping at the altar of empirical evidence pressed down on him. How many times had he dismissed others' spiritual experiences as emotional weakness? How often had he proudly declared that truth only existed in what could be proven? Show him what else his rational mind missed, Cassius called out, his voice steady against Meridian's assault. The vision shifted again. Now Zephyr saw Sarah in her studio, painting those impossible sunsets. But this time, he saw what his logical mind had refused to acknowledge. How the colors she used matched precise wavelengths of divine light. How her seemingly random brushstrokes formed patterns that echoed through creation itself. Your wife saw truth that transcended physical laws, Reverend Devereaux added, and your daughter inherited that vision. Another shift, and he was watching Vesper as a child, drawing pictures that his rational mind had dismissed as childish imagination. Now he saw that her crayon scribbles had unknowingly captured glimpses of spiritual architecture, her young mind still open to realities that his educated cynicism had long since rejected. But the evidence, he whispered, still struggling. All my life, I've trusted in what could be proven. And where did that trust lead you? Detective Ravencroft stepped forward, the file in her hands pulsing with truth. The same evidence you worship was corrupted, the security footage edited, the fingerprints planted, the financial records falsified. Your perfect system of provable facts was turned against you. Meridian laughed, the sound distorting the air into painful geometries. Because that's all your precious evidence ever was. Numbers and measurements that could be manipulated by anyone clever enough to understand them. You're not really seeing divine mathematics now, architect. You're having a mental breakdown brought on by years of unjust imprisonment. Return to your rational world. It's so much simpler there. For a moment, her words almost swayed him. The logical explanation was so tempting. A psychological break would explain everything he was experiencing. It would fit neatly into his old worldview. No supernatural elements required. But then he remembered the moment in Trinity Sanctuary when he'd touched Officer Reynolds' spirit. The pure truth of that connection couldn't be explained away by psychology. The mathematical perfection of what he'd witnessed went beyond anything his mind could have invented. You're right about one thing, Zephyr said, straightening to his full height. I am having a breakdown, but not of my mind, of my limitations. As he spoke these words, something profound shifted within him. The barrier between his logical mind and his awakening spirit dissolved. Suddenly he could see both realities simultaneously, the physical world with its measurable laws and the spiritual realm with its divine mathematics. They weren't separate at all, but rather different expressions of the same fundamental truth. The evidence isn't corrupt, he continued, understanding flowing through him like light. The corruption is in believing that physical evidence is the only kind that exists. True mathematics encompasses both what can be measured and what can only be perceived through faith. The geometric storm above them responded to his realization. The competing equations began to align themselves into new patterns, not the rigid structures of pure physics, nor the fluid forms of pure spirit, but a perfect integration of both. No. Meridian's form flickered as her corrupt calculations began to lose their hold. You cannot bridge that gap. The division between physical and spiritual law is what gives me my power. Division is an illusion, Cassius declared, and for the first time, Zephyr saw his friend's true nature. The older inmate's form dissolved into pure mathematical truth, living equations that had walked among men, waiting for someone who could comprehend both their physical and spiritual aspects. That's why you were chosen. Reverend Devereaux's voice carried the weight of divine revelation. Not despite your logical mind, but because of it. Heaven needed someone who could understand physical laws so completely that when they were shown spiritual mathematics, they could recognize the same divine hand at work in both. The realization broke over Zephyr like a wave of light. Every equation he'd ever solved, every structure he'd ever designed, every measurement he'd ever made, they had all been preparation. His devotion to mathematical truth hadn't led him away from God. It had been teaching him God's language all along. Standing in that moment of perfect clarity, Zephyr finally understood what he had to do. But the choice before him was staggering. He could retreat into his comfortable world of pure logic, dismissing all he'd witnessed as a delusion. Or he could fully embrace this expanded reality, becoming something that his former self would have said was impossible. As Meridian gathered her dark equations for another assault, as Detective Ravencroft clutched her file of physical evidence, as the very foundations of Shadowvale trembled with competing mathematics, Zephyr faced the most profound calculation of his life: how to solve an equation that demanded both perfect logic and perfect faith. In that moment of decision, time seemed to fold in on itself like a geometric origami, and memories burst through the fabric of reality. But these weren't just recollections. They were windows into truth he'd been too blind to see, moments that now reflected back at him with new significance. He was 6 years old, sitting in his father's workshop, watching Magnus measure a piece of wood for the 100th time. Measure twice, cut once, his father always said. But now, Zephyr saw something more in the memory. Behind his father's careful measurements had been an intuition that transcended mere numbers, a sense of the wood's spiritual nature, its connection to the living tree it had once been. Your father wasn't just measuring dimensions, Cassius's voice guided him through the memory. He was reading the wood's story, its purpose. Every grain pattern was a letter in God's handwriting. The scene shifted. Now he was 15, standing in church with Sarah for the first time. He'd gone only to please her, his teenage mind already forming logical arguments against faith. But in that memory, he now saw what his younger self had missed. The church's architecture, which he'd dismissed as mere aesthetic design, had incorporated divine ratios that his mathematical mind had unconsciously recognized. Even then, God had been speaking to him in the language he understood best: pure geometric truth. The blueprints of every true house of worship, Reverend Devereaux explained, are first drawn in heaven. Another fold in time. Sarah in her studio during her final days, painting what he'd thought were fever-induced visions. Her canvas had been filled with swirling patterns that he'd attributed to her declining health. Now he saw them for what they truly were: glimpses of divine architecture breaking through into physical reality. His dying wife had seen the mathematical patterns that held the universe together. "She was trying to show you," Meridian taunted, her dark equations pulsing. "But you were too proud in your logic to see. Even at the end, you tried to quantify her death with medical statistics instead of holding her hand and sharing her vision." The barb struck deep, but before guilt could take root, another memory surfaced. He was holding Sarah's hand in her final moments, desperately reciting survival rates and treatment possibilities. But she had smiled, squeezed his hand, and whispered something he'd forgotten until now. "My love, you see God's precision in every equation. Someday you'll understand that faith is the most precise calculation of all." The memories came faster now, each one a mirror reflecting truth he'd been unable to perceive. Vesper, at age 7, trying to show him a drawing of her guardian angel. He'd explained away the mathematical perfection of her sketched wings, missing the divine geometry in his daughter's untrained hand. His first day designing the Obsidian Tower, when inspiration had flowed so freely that the calculations seemed to write themselves. He'd attributed it to professional expertise, not recognizing the whispers of divine architecture guiding his work. The day of his arrest, when he'd noticed a strange pattern in the sunlight falling through his office window, the same pattern that now pulsed through Shadowvale's spiritual foundation. Every memory reflected back a deeper truth, showing him how divine mathematics had been woven through his entire life. Even his imprisonment had been part of a larger equation, one designed to bring him to this exact moment of understanding. "Do you see now?" Cassius asked, his form shifting between human and living mathematics. Every moment of your life was preparation for this choice. Even your devotion to logic was part of God's calculation. The memory stream reached the present, but with a crucial difference. Now Zephyr could see the spiritual equations that had been running beneath every moment of his existence. His entire life had been a proof building toward an inescapable conclusion. "Your mistake," Meridian snarled, her corrupt calculations writhing, "was in thinking that logic and faith were opposed. That precision and spirituality couldn't coexist. It made you the perfect victim for my twisted justice." "No," Zephyr said, understanding flowing through him like light. "My mistake was in thinking they were separate at all. True logic always points to God. I just couldn't see the full equation." As if triggered by his words, one final memory surfaced. But this one was different. He was back in his office on the day of Aldrich's murder, but now he could see everything his physical eyes had missed. Dark equations had swirled around his partner's body, bearing Meridian's corrupt signature. The security cameras hadn't just been disabled, they'd been mathematically erased from reality itself. But something else had been present too. A perfect geometric pattern hanging in the air above Aldrich's body, recording the truth in a language more precise than any digital camera. The divine mathematics of reality itself had witnessed the crime. "That's right," Detective Ravencroft said, her file blazing brighter. "The evidence I found isn't just physical proof. It's the shadow of a higher truth breaking through into our world. The memory shattered like a mirror, its fragments reflecting infinite calculations, both earthly and divine." Zephyr stood in the eye of the geometric storm, finally able to see all the dimensions of his journey, the physical, the spiritual, and the mathematical truth that united them. Meridian's dark equations pressed in, trying to corrupt this moment of clarity. "Even if you see the truth now, you can't change what's already been calculated. The evidence is corrupted, the witnesses are silenced, the numbers all point to your guilt." But Zephyr wasn't listening anymore. His awakened consciousness was expanding through Shadowvale's divine architecture, reading the original equations that had been written into its very foundations. The prison wasn't just a building or even a spiritual fortress. It was a proof, a divine calculation designed to reveal ultimate truth. And in that moment, as past and present aligned in perfect geometric harmony, Zephyr finally understood what he had to do. The equation that would defeat Meridian's corruption wasn't just mathematical or spiritual, it was both, a perfect integration of everything he was and everything he had become. The only question was, did he have the courage to solve it? The geometric storm above Shadowvale had reached its peak, divine and corrupt mathematics clashing in patterns that threatened to tear reality apart. Lightning struck the prison's watchtowers in precise golden ratios, while darkness pooled in angles that defied Euclidean geometry. The moment of ultimate choice had arrived. "You know what you have to do," Cassius said, his form now pure mathematical light. "The equation can only be solved through perfect sacrifice." Meridian's laughter cut through the chaos like a poisoned theorem. "Yes, tell him what's required. Tell him the price of your divine mathematics." Reverend Devereaux stepped forward, his wings forming arrays of sacred geometry. "To defeat corruption that has taken root in the physical world, the equation demands a willing sacrifice of everything you once believed in. You must surrender your old understanding completely. Including your chance at freedom," Detective Ravencroft added quietly, her file of evidence dimming slightly. "The proof I've found could clear you legally, return you to your old life, but using it would mean playing by Meridian's rules, accepting her corrupt system of physical evidence and legal mathematics." Zephyr looked at the file in her hands, seeing how its light pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. Physical proof of his innocence, everything he'd prayed for during those long nights in his cell. With it, he could be free, return to Vesper, rebuild his life. All he had to do was let Meridian's corrupt mathematics continue to rule the justice system. "Think carefully, Architect," Meridian purred, her dark equations weaving seductively around him. "You've seen behind the veil now, witnessed the divine mathematics. You could go back to your life with that knowledge, work within my system while secretly understanding the deeper truth." Isn't that a better calculation than throwing everything away? The offer was tempting. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Around them, Shadowvale's prisoners and guards stood frozen, unwitting witnesses to a battle that would determine far more than one man's fate. "When my father taught me to measure," Zephyr said slowly, memories flowing through him like light. "He never just measured the wood. He measured the space around it, the air it would displace, the weight it would bear. He taught me that true measurement considers everything." As he spoke, divine equations began to flow from his words, forming patterns in the air that made Meridian's darkness recoil. "So, let me measure everything now," he continued, his consciousness expanding to encompass all of Shadowvale. "Let me calculate the full cost." In his awakened sight, he could see the corruption that had taken root in the justice system. Countless souls trapped by Meridian's twisted mathematics, evidence falsified through equations of darkness, truth buried under calculated lies. The pattern stretched back centuries, each corrupt verdict strengthening her power. "If I accept your offer," he said to Meridian, "I save myself but sacrifice something greater. The divine mathematics show me the ripple effect. Every future case you'll corrupt, every life you'll destroy, every truth you'll bury. The cost is infinite." "And the cost of refusing me?" Meridian's voice held an edge of concern now. "Measure that, architect." Zephyr closed his eyes, letting the calculations flow through him. He saw himself remaining in prison, his name never cleared in the physical world. Saw Vesper struggling with the weight of his apparent guilt. Saw his professional reputation permanently stained, his achievements forgotten. But then the divine mathematics showed him something else. How his sacrifice would create a fracture in Meridian's power. How choosing truth over freedom would initiate a cascading equation that would eventually expose all her corruption. His choice wasn't just about his own fate, it was about breaking her hold on justice itself. "You're right," he said, opening his eyes. "I should measure everything. So let me show you my calculations." Stepping forward, Zephyr placed one hand on Shadowvale's wall and raised the other to the geometric storm above. As he did, every mathematical principle he'd ever learned merged with the divine equations he'd been shown. Physical and spiritual laws aligned perfectly, revealing the ultimate calculation. "The price of truth," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of both science and faith, "is everything I once thought I knew. The reward is everything I never knew existed." The wall beneath his hand began to pulse with light as Shadowvale's original architecture responded to his choice. The prison's divine geometry, dormant for so long, awakened fully. Every measurement, every angle, every calculation the first architect had hidden in its design became active. "No." Meridian's form began to destabilize as the corrupted mathematics she'd woven through the justice system started to unravel. "You'll lose everything." "Not everything," Zephyr said calmly. "Just everything I wrongly valued." Detective Ravencroft stepped forward, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're choosing to stay imprisoned in the physical world so truth can be free in both realms." "The evidence in your file would free my body," Zephyr nodded. "But surrendering it will free something much larger. The divine mathematics require a pure equation, sacrificing physical freedom to gain spiritual truth." As he spoke these words, the geometric storm reached its crescendo. The choice hung in the balance, written in mathematics both earthly and divine. In that moment of decision, Zephyr saw every calculation that had led him here, the precise measurements of his father's workshop, teaching him to value truth above all. Sarah's artistic vision, showing him that some things transcended physical laws. Vesper's childlike faith, pointing toward realities he'd been too blind to see. His own imprisonment, stripping away everything until he could perceive divine mathematics. All of it had been preparation for this choice. "The equation demands completion," Cassius urged. "What is your final calculation?" Meridian gathered her dark mathematics for one final assault. "Choose wisely, architect." Some choices can never be unmade. Above them, heaven waited. Beneath them, Shadowvale's foundations trembled. Around them, reality held its breath, waiting to see which mathematics would prevail. The corrupt equations of false justice or the divine calculations of eternal truth. Zephyr lifted his face to the geometric storm and made his choice. "I calculate everything," Zephyr said, his voice resonating with newfound power. "I measure every angle, every outcome, every possibility, and I choose truth over freedom." As the words left his mouth, Detective Ravencroft's file burst into flames of pure light. The evidence that could have freed him in the physical realm transformed into something greater, proof of a higher truth that transcended human justice. The ashes swirled upward, joining the geometric storm in patterns that made Meridian shriek with rage. "Fool!" she cried, her form distorting as her corrupt mathematics began to lose their grip on reality. "You've condemned yourself." "No," Zephyr replied calmly. "I've freed everyone you've ever condemned." The sacrifice triggered a cascade of divine equations. Every wrongful conviction Meridian had engineered over the centuries began to unravel. The dark mathematics she'd woven through the justice system started to dissolve, revealed by the pure light of truth. But the price was immense. Zephyr could feel himself being written into a new equation, one that required his continued imprisonment. "The physical evidence of your innocence is gone," Reverend Devereaux said softly. "In the eyes of the world's law, you will remain guilty. But in the eyes of divine law," Cassius added, his mathematical light pulsing brighter, "you have become something far more powerful than an innocent man. You have become a living calculation of truth itself." The transformation was already beginning. Zephyr could feel his old identity dissolving, replaced by something both more and less than what he had been. His architectural knowledge merged with divine mathematics. His understanding of physical laws transformed into comprehension of spiritual principles. He was becoming a living bridge between two realities. Shadowvale's walls began to shimmer as their true purpose was finally fulfilled. The prison wasn't just built to contain, it was designed to transform. Every cell became a point in a vast geometric proof, every corridor a line in an eternal equation. The first architect had created not just a building but a machine for converting physical imprisonment into spiritual freedom. "You don't understand what you're becoming," Meridian snarled, making one last attempt to corrupt the transformation. "An eternal prisoner bound by your own choice, watching others go free while you remain chained." But her words no longer held power. Zephyr saw through her corrupt calculations to the truth beneath. His sacrifice was multiplying, creating fractures in her dark equations that would eventually shatter her entire system. Every day he remained imprisoned would be another crack in her power, another proof that truth transcended physical evidence. The geometric storm reached its peak, divine mathematics pouring down like rain. Where it touched the prison walls, corrupted calculations dissolved, revealing the sacred geometry beneath. Where it touched the inmates, it burned away false guilt while preserving true repentance. Where it touched the guards, it transformed their authority from physical to spiritual power. But when it touched Zephyr, it did something more profound. It rewrote his very being into a new kind of equation. "The sacrifice is not just your freedom," Cassius explained, watching the transformation with ancient eyes. "It is your entire former understanding of reality. You will never again see the world as you once did. Every calculation will reveal its spiritual dimension. Every measurement will show its divine purpose." Zephyr felt the truth of these words as his consciousness expanded. He saw how his imprisonment would affect future cases. Judges finding mysterious gaps in corrupt evidence. Defenders suddenly understanding deeper patterns of truth. Prosecutors feeling inexplicable urges to double-check their accusations. His sacrifice was creating a cascade of divine intervention that would slowly but inexorably purify the justice system. "Even your daughter will not understand," Reverend Devereaux warned gently. "To the world, you will remain a convicted murderer who found God in prison. They will see your faith as a coping mechanism, your divine mathematics as the delusions of a guilty man seeking redemption. But some will see the truth. Detective Ravencroft interjected, her badge glowing brighter as she aligned with divine justice. Those with eyes to see will recognize what you've become. Your sacrifice will create ripples that transform lives in ways that can never be measured by human standards. As if to confirm her words, the geometric storm began to coalesce into a new pattern. The mathematics of heaven and earth aligned perfectly, revealing the full scope of what Zephyr's choice had set in motion. His sacrifice was becoming a cornerstone in a larger equation, one that would eventually recalculate the very foundations of justice. The true sacrifice, Zephyr said, understanding flowing through him, isn't just staying in prison. It's becoming something new, a living calculation, a proof that truth exists beyond physical evidence. The transformation accelerated. Divine mathematics burned through him like purifying fire, scouring away his old identity. The architect who had worshipped pure logic was becoming something that transcended both science and faith, a living bridge between physical and spiritual reality. Meridian made one final, desperate attempt to corrupt the process. Her dark equations swirled around him, offering one last chance to recant. Think of Vesper. Think of your life. You're choosing eternal imprisonment over your own daughter. But even this most painful truth had been calculated in Zephyr's divine mathematics. He saw how his sacrifice would eventually reach Vesper, not as the proof of innocence he'd once desperately wanted to show her, but as something deeper. She would come to understand, in her own time and her own way, that some truths couldn't be proven through evidence alone. I choose this, Zephyr declared, embracing the transformation completely. I choose to remain bound so that truth can be free. I choose to become a living calculation of divine justice. As he spoke these words, his sacrifice became complete. The geometric storm swept through Shadowvale one final time, transforming the prison from a place of physical confinement into a nexus of spiritual liberation. And at its center stood Zephyr, no longer just an architect of physical structures, but a living proof that some equations could only be solved through perfect sacrifice. 5 years after the geometric storm transformed Shadowvale, visitors to the prison often reported strange experiences. Some spoke of mathematical patterns appearing in the sunlight that streamed through cell windows. Others described feeling unexplainable peace in certain corridors, as if the very angles of the walls had been calculated to soothe troubled souls. And everyone who encountered inmate 247891, the architect who had supposedly found God, walked away changed in ways they couldn't quite explain. Zephyr still lived in his cell, but he no longer saw bars and concrete. His transformed vision revealed the divine mathematics flowing through every surface, every space, every moment. What others perceived as a prison, he recognized as a nexus of spiritual equations, constantly calculating redemption. The changes his sacrifice had initiated rippled outward in ever-expanding circles. Meridian's corrupt mathematics, though not completely erased, had been fundamentally weakened. Throughout the justice system, her carefully constructed web of false evidence and twisted testimonies began to unravel. Detective Ravencroft, now promoted to head of the department's new Justice Review Unit, found herself solving cold cases with inexplicable insight. Evidence that had been buried for years surfaced in patterns that seemed almost divinely orchestrated. Corrupt officials suddenly felt compelled to confess, their testimonies often beginning with the same words, "I had the strangest dream about mathematical truth." But the most profound transformations happened within Shadowvale itself. The prison had become a place where divine calculations worked openly, turning physical confinement into spiritual liberation. Inmates who spent time near Zephyr's cell reported dreams of geometric patterns that showed them the true nature of their crimes and the path to redemption. Guard Cyrus Ambrose, who had witnessed the Great Transformation, became known for his uncanny ability to predict and prevent violence before it erupted. "The angles tell me," he would say with a knowing smile, tapping the wall where divine equations glowed visible only to those with eyes to see. Reverend Devereux's services in Trinity Sanctuary now attracted inmates who had never shown interest in faith before. They came not for traditional religion, but for what they called the architect's mathematics. A perfect fusion of scientific precision and spiritual truth that spoke to both mind and soul. Cassius remained as well, his ageless presence a reminder that some equations had been calculating since the beginning of time. He and Zephyr spent long hours discussing divine mathematics, their conversations echoing through Shadowvale's corridors in patterns that made even the most hardened inmates pause and wonder. And then there was Vesper. She had come to visit her father 1 year after the transformation, expecting to find a broken man clinging to religion for comfort. What she found instead defied her expectations. "The numbers still speak to me," Zephyr had told her during that first visit, his eyes alight with an inner fire that both frightened and fascinated her. "But now they tell a deeper story. Want me to show you?" He had taken a piece of paper and begun drawing. What started as a simple geometric proof transformed before her eyes into something more, a mathematical expression of love that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, she glimpsed what her mother had always seen, the divine hand writing love letters in the language of mathematics. Now she visited regularly, bringing her sketchbook. Together, they explored the intersection of art and divine geometry that Sarah had once tried to show them both. Slowly, the wall between father and daughter dissolved, replaced by a different kind of equation, one that calculated healing through acceptance rather than evidence. The official record still listed Zephyr as guilty. His appeal options had expired, and the evidence that might have cleared him had been transformed into something far more powerful. But those who knew him understood that he was serving a higher sentence, one that imprisoned his body to free countless souls. Meridian never fully recovered from the fracturing of her dark mathematics. She still operated within the justice system, but her power was diminished, her corrupt calculations constantly disrupted by the pure equations radiating from Shadowvale. Sometimes, on stormy nights, she could be seen standing outside the prison walls, staring up at Zephyr's window with a mixture of rage and reluctant awe. "You sacrificed everything," she had said during their last confrontation. "And for what?" "For truth," he had replied simply. "Some equations can only be solved by removing yourself from both sides of the formula." The geometric storm that had transformed Shadowvale never truly ended. It just changed form. Now it manifested in smaller ways, in the precise angles of sunlight that fell on repentant hearts, in the mathematical patterns that appeared to guide lost souls home, in the divine calculations that slowly but surely restored justice to its true foundations. And at the center of it all remained Zephyr, the architect who had learned to see beyond physical dimensions. His imprisonment had become a cornerstone in God's mathematics, a living proof that some truths could never be contained by mere evidence. Some equations required faith to solve, and some freedoms could only be found by choosing to remain bound. For in the end, he had discovered what Sarah had tried to tell him all along, that the most perfect calculations were written not in numbers, but in sacrificial love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. ***.